Well, hello everybody and welcome along to this video. Mr. Johnson teaches Kamikaze revision for you. This is part of your GCSE English Literature. It will be in paper 2, section B, and a reminder that this is where the exam board will print a question and print a poem for you, and it is up to you to choose a poem which you think best answers that question and can be compared to the other poem. So it may be that Kamikaze is the one that is printed for you, it may be that Kamikaze is the one that you choose. Either way, you're going to want to revise it and know it. It's a good poem which certainly crosses over with a lot of themes with other poems, making it a good one for comparing. So you will need to be ready to pause this video and add notes to your copy of the poem, please. And with that in mind, make sure you have got a copy of the poem ready for this little revision lesson. It may be you want to get one off the internet. If you search for Kamikaze Beatrice Garland, you'll find it there. There's also a copy on the BBC Bite-Size Kamikaze page as well. It's not printed clearly, you need to click on it, but it is there for you. So if you haven't got one, pause this video now and make sure you go and grab yourself a copy of the poem, please, or pen and paper. And here we go. So Beatrice Garland, there's not a huge amount of information that I've certainly been able to find about her. From what I can tell, she began writing in 1989, but actually works in the NHS and teaching as well. So poetry is not her main job. She certainly is a poet, but isn't a poet by profession. And as it says there, I spend a lot of the day listening to other people's worlds. So by writing Kamikaze, it's not that she has some special link to the war or somebody serving in the war, but clearly took an interest in this world and then used that as inspiration for writing this poem. So Kamikaze is the name of the poem, of course, and some context for you then, as it says on the screen. I won't read this word for word. This did come from BBC Bite-Size, so credit to those guys. The Second World War we're talking about here, and we're talking about Japan, and the word kamikaze, Japanese fighter pilots who were sent on these suicide missions, they had to fly their planes and then fly them into warships in order to try and destroy these warships or sink these warships and certainly kill lots of people. It's an idea that many of us find really sort of hard to take, appalling, strange, that these fighter pilots were willing to sacrifice their lives, although the more you read into it you realise that they all certainly weren't keen and eager to kill themselves, but that's a whole different sort of thing to explore yourself. Interestingly, the word kamikaze literally translates as divine wind. So when you look at the title of this poem, and I've always said in all my videos that titles matter, kamikaze, divine wind, divine, like coming from the gods almost, which has this really sort of mythological and almost beautiful connotation to it, and yet that almost covers up and masks the actual act that these guys were doing. And wind obviously is very natural as well. So think about that when it comes to the title. You want to now quickly, if you haven't done so, pause this video and just read this poem to yourself so you've got it fresh in your mind as we go through it. If you prefer it, BBC Bite-Size again have done a recording of somebody reading it with some images playing over the top. There's a link there, or you can search for it yourself, BBC Bite-Size Kamikaze. Either way, pause this video and make sure you've read this poem to yourself before we continue. And let's go on. So as always with my videos, I will try and point you towards some of the key bits out of this. This is revision, so it's not going to cover everything you ever need to know, but certainly trying to aim to cover some of the big points. Have your pen ready, be ready to pause this video. Firstly, you've got her father embarked at sunrise, so we have to wonder who her is, who they're talking about. Sunrise, I mean, you've got imagery there, the photo shows it as well. The rising sun was certainly an image associated with Japan and still is part of their flag in a slightly different way now. With a flask of water, samurai sword, I mean, that carries with it connotations of violence, but also something very cultural to do with Japan, but also something very historical as well, because they aren't intending to use this samurai sword on enemies. A shaven head. So again, military connotations, full of powerful incantations, another word for sort of spells and magic. So it's almost the idea of brainwashing going on there as well. And enough fuel for a one-way journey into history, because they were quite literally given enough fuel for a one-way journey, so they couldn't easily turn back. So there you go, there's your first stanza, instantly establishing what's going on in the poem. But then there's a bit of a shift almost. But halfway there, she thought, so again, we're talking about the person who's heard this story of the pilot who turned back, because halfway there, she thought, not the pilot, Recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. I mean, that image tries to capture a little bit of what it might have been like looking down for him as well. Strung out like bunting, really positive connotations with that. The idea of bunting. Normally celebrations that we associate with that. Little bunting strung out like bunting, so the fact it's a simile as well means that we can easily identify it if we're talking about it in our answers. The green-blue translucent sea. We've got double adjective going on there. The green-blue is one coupled together, and then the translucent is the next one. Translucent is like you can see there, you can almost see through it. Really beautiful imagery, natural imagery as well. There's lots of that natural imagery in this poem. So it's very much a contrast, I would say. You always need to try and write down the effect of these things as well. It's no good just saying natural imagery. The effect of it is very calming, very soothing, and in many ways juxtaposes the violence of war, which is essentially what this poem is focusing on as well. Moving on. Beneath them, arcing in swathes, so like moving around in these sort of sweeping arc type patterns, like a huge flag. If you imagine someone waving a huge flag, it sort of swifts one way and then the other, as it says in the poem, in fact, in a figure of 8. So again, giving it another simile there as well. But again, natural imagery, we're talking about looking down into the ocean and seeing these fish. The dark shoals. Now there's a slight tonal shift there, shift in the tone of it. These dark shoals of fish, flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun. Once again, you've got some very natural imagery going on there. Also like these sibilant sounds, the sibilants, these S sounds, again creating this very sort of calming almost effect on us as a reader as well. Once again, really contrasting what's going on. And it's lots of not juxtaposition, I meant to say enjambment. We've got lots of these lines and these stanzas are spilling into each other as well. So there's sort of a structure to this, a bit like there's a structure to a story, and yet also the structure is broken. Try and think what that might be mirroring, a broken structure. What else in the poem could be broken? I mean, maybe you could say the broken relationship between the pilot and his family now because he came back. It's things like that. Mirroring is a really good word to try and use. When you've got something, can you see if it's almost mirroring something which is happening in the poem, like I just demonstrated to you there? Anyway, back to this one. Remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns. That's what's in the photo there. Cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see who's withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers. So they're building towers to see whose will survive the waves that are coming in and crashing on them, the breakers crashing onto them, bringing their father's boat safe. So it's almost like they're waiting for their father to come back from something. Cairns associated with death. I mean, old tombs would certainly have cairns built onto them. So again, a little bit of imagery, very natural, once as continues the theme of the poem, but also this sort of imagery of death, perhaps you could argue. And then it switches. Notice it's in italics there. Yes, grandfather's boat. It's almost like the voice drops out of storytelling and answers a question, which is why it's the question answer is being written in italics to show it's different from the story. Yes, grandfather's boat. So maybe this is daughter telling the story to her children. Yes, it's your grandfather's boat. Safe to the shore. Lots of sibilant sound here as well. Salt sodden awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and the tuna, the dark prince of the sea. I mean, silver makes it sound really precious as well and really beautiful. Lots of listing going on there as well. Again, the tuna maybe like the dark prince, muscular, dangerous, perhaps highlighting the dangers of nature, you could argue there. And then we come into the final stanza. Now it's all in italics. It's like the story has stopped of what he saw, and now we're into his return. So you can look structurally at the shift, the storytelling now into this slightly different voice. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, treated them like he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed. So that stanza really is sort of, I find quite sad, quite honestly, if I'm honest with you. This really does start to capture the tone of the poem, or certainly the message of the poem. Like meeting his eyes. It's like he's brought shame on the family, as it says in that second to last line, like he treated him like he no longer existed. And then it moves on to this. The children chattered and laughed until gradually we too learned to be silent, live as though he never returned, no longer the father we loved. And then we've got this standing out because it's not in italics, and I think really the final lines are the message of the poem absolutely here. So again, good ones to try and learn if you're going to have some quotes in your head for the exam. Sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Had it been better to have died in battle, or is it almost better to be or die in the sense of he hasn't literally died here, but by returning and being cut off by his family, he might as well be dead because he's got no one talking to him. So it's really a sad sort of ending to the poem, I would say, there for you. But again, as I mentioned, really good lines to remember for taking into the exam. Which poems could you compare it to? Well, it does always depend on the question with this one. Lots of natural imagery, so maybe conjure up some other poems in your head which have got natural imagery. I would instantly point you towards Extract from the Prelude is one like that. Other poems, well, if you go down a war theme, you've got Poppies, similar because it's very gentle in its imagery and choices. Remains, very different because that's got much more violent imagery in it, but both show the effects that war have on people, and both of them are about people who have survived battle as well in some different senses. So I mean, those are some instant comparisons you can make. Kamikaze does compare well with lots of poems. In many ways it compares well because it is soft and others can be quite violent. So if you've got a violent poem printed in your exam question, perhaps you could consider this one because of the fact it is quite delicate and soft in its imagery. But again, nature, Storm on the Island would be another very different one as well. This one is about war, Storm is not, but Storm also uses lots of warlike imagery in it. So there you go, a few comparisons. It does obviously depend on the question. You're going to want to pause this. I'm not going to have time to read through all of these. These questions are designed to try and make you go back, look at your poem and add some notes to it, particularly the later questions talking about conflict and power, because these are power and conflict poems. So pause this, have a go at using those to annotate your poem for me. And finally, have a go at this question. It's not like an exam question in the sense it doesn't ask you to compare, but it does ask you to explore the poem. How does Garland present the effect of war on people? So, I mean, that's an interesting one. People, you could instantly choose the soldier. You could choose the family here. I would suggest to you it's probably easier to choose the soldier. On my next slide, I have got an example paragraph where I've had a go at this. When you come to do yours, I put on the middle of that box on your screen there, focus maybe on the contrasting imagery, and the tone of the ending perhaps is something you could talk about. If you're talking about the effect of war on people, look at the ending as really capturing that message, but also the contrasting imagery between like very nice nature, but also the dark tone in the middle as well, maybe sort of showing how he's been treated by his family. And you're going to want to pause this to read it for yourself. I'm not going to have time to read through all of it, only to point out the bold underlined bits of sentence starters. Once again, I've tried to use the same ones in lots of my videos to try and sort of give you a structure to follow when it comes to your writing. I start off in the blue by answering the question, but also linking it to something that happens in the poem. So not retelling the story, but so much as using something in the poem to prove the question. Then I've, in my second blue sentence, third blue sentence, talked about the method that's been used. Always really important to identify a method. I've dropped in an embedded quote as my evidence in green. And then in the red bit, there's my analysis where I'm trying to unpick a little bit some of what's been used. And then finally in purple, that's really, really important. The red and the purple bits are where you show the examiner you really have thought about this poem. The purple particularly is you've understood the message of the poem and understood why Beatrice Garland in this case has written it. So have a read of my answer, then go back a slide and have a go on the video at the next question. Other than that, it just leaves me time to say I wish you the very best of luck when it comes to your exams, whether you're watching this as a year 9, 10 or 11. Whenever it comes to those exams, keep calm. It's your opportunity to show the examiner that you are a clever person who can think, and that's what poetry is all about. It's meant to be giving you a chance to look at someone else's life and show what you have understood about what they're trying to teach you. So this is Mr. Johnson saying good luck, goodbye, and thanks for listening.